World War I is often called a 19th century war fought with 20th century weapons, which in my opinion is one of the best explanations for what World War I actually looked like. We'll go a little more in detail on what that actually means in a moment. So this is Unified Part 1B, World War I itself, so what happened during the war as well as what happened after the war itself. So, why is it a world war? You can just take a quick look at this map and you see the answer to your question. Everyone who is green in this map was part of the Entente or Allied powers before the war, and everyone who is light green will eventually join the Allied sides, and everyone who is orange in this map is part of the Central Powers. So what you're noticing is most of the world at some point eventually becomes a part of World War I. Whether it's like the United States that eventually fully commits and send troops, or like Central American nations who will provide supplies and money. Even Mexico, even though they don't get involved, they will provide a substantial percentage of the oil that the British Navy is going to use. So even some of the countries that aren't colored, they are involved because they're financially a part of the World War. All the fighting is, well, not all, but most of the fighting is in Europe, albeit there's some in the colonies as well, but almost the entire world is involved in this war. Part of the reason, again, being India is a colony of Great Britain, so if Great Britain goes to war, they're also going to call in India and Australia and the African colonies. Same with France. They have West Africa, so they're going to pull West African troops. Okay, so soldiers mobilized. It eventually, quickly became a war to a level no one had ever seen before. France mobilizes more than 8 million soldiers. Germany mobilizes 11 million. Russia mobilizes 12 million. Great Britain mobilizes 9 million soldiers, a lot of those soldiers coming from their colonies. So it quickly became a two-front war. So on one side, so the funny thing is Germany feared fighting a two-front war. They had France to the west and Russia to the east. So Germany's plan is to invade France through Belgium. So they invade Belgium first to then invade France, defeat France quickly, and then turn around and face Russia, who they feared the most. You saw the troops mobilized. Russia had a monster of an army. Germany did not want to take on Russia with only half of its army. Germany's plan, knock out France quickly in the war, turn all its troops, take on Russia. It's named after the German general Schlieffen, was nicknamed the Schlieffen Plan. However, the unintended consequence, Great Britain up to this point had not actually joined the war, but Britain was allied with Belgium. Once Belgium was invaded, Great Britain had no choice but to invade on the Allied side. And with the British involvement, it stops the German army outside of Paris, France. So let me show you the map. So essentially, here's the French-German border, and France is arming this border to the teeth. They're putting all of their forces up against this border. So what does Germany do? Why attack them straight on when we can go through Belgium? France isn't going to put many forces on their Belgian border because they're friendly with Belgium. Belgium's not a nation they're expecting an attack from. So Germany rushes through Belgium, goes through the undefended border, and it's only because of the incoming British and quickly retreating French forces that this plan was able to be stopped. And because it was stopped, it then became a two-front war. When it stopped, though, the soldiers then resorted to trench warfare, which we'll talk about what that is in a second. And so it became a war of attrition. So on the Western Front, essentially this war, the most movement and most exciting changes happened in the first couple weeks of the war. Once things settled down, it's going to be years of trench warfare. So on the Western Front, soldiers on both sides dug down and trench warfare began. Mostly Germany versus Britain and France on the Western Front. There's also a large number of soldiers from the colonies. There's a large contingency of Canadian soldiers, Australian soldiers, Indian soldiers, Algerian soldiers from the French colonies. Great Britain is going to, from deaths, lose so many of its British soldiers so quickly that without its colonial soldiers, arguably this war has a completely different tone. So trench warfare, both sides would fight from trenches within firing range of each other, only leaving their trench to charge the opposite trench, which usually resulted in huge casualties. So this is on the Western Front. This is Germany versus France, Great Britain. Eventually, the United States will become a part of this, but that's going to take several years for that. On the Eastern Front is Germany / Austria-Hungary versus Russia and as well as Serbia down here. So the Eastern Front, there was fighting between German / Austria-Hungary / the Ottoman Empire against the Russian / Serbian forces. The fighting involved some trenches, but it was a lot more open fighting than on the Western Front. This leads to brutal levels of casualties. As large as the Russian forces were, their level of casualties outranks every other nation, and it's going to lead to outright rebellion known as the Russian Revolution. The Russian government was already unpopular leading into this war, and because of the monstrous levels of casualties being sustained by Russian peasants who are being called to duty for battle, they start to feel like that the Russian Tsar is they're sending them to their death. It's a death sentence to send them to the Eastern Front. And so eventually this turns around and turns into the Russian Revolution, which leads to the Soviet Union. We'll talk more about that later. That's actually part 2 of this unit. But just know now, the cause of the Russian Revolution in the Soviet Union was how much of a disaster World War I was for the Russians. The British Navy also blockaded all of the German ports, and that's going to be extremely important later. Neither side on either front could outright defeat the other side in a single battle. However, neither side could also lose to the other side in a single battle. So it became a war of attrition. The first couple months of 1914 were far and away the most eventful months of World War I. After everything gets settled down, they all dig into trenches, and it becomes a grueling war of attrition where both sides are just attempting to wear out, outlast, and demoralize the other side into surrendering. All sides are still very powerful, but no side is powerful enough to actually defeat the other side. So this becomes a multi-front war. Most of World War I that you know, the trench warfare, is happening on the Western Front. On the Eastern Front is the main thing to know that's going on there is the Germans. If you look at this line, the Germans drive deep into Russia. This is actually where the Germans were far more successful on the Eastern Front, and it's what causes the Russian Revolution and eventual overthrow of the Russian Tsar government that we'll talk about next unit. So, to talk about a couple battles and what they look like, I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Battles were in the trenches. Once the initial push of the Schlieffen Plan settled down, soldiers dug into trenches, and right within a football field's distance away was soldiers in the other trenches. And so if you look right here, this is a top-down view. You might have, this is the British lines, this is the German lines. And they're within shouting distance of each other. There's numerous stories of British soldiers shouting at and sometimes even talking with German soldiers. This is at most 100 yards away from each other. This area is known as no man's land. And you have barbed wire on both sides. And you got to keep in mind, you have modern technology. Both sides, these divots right here, these are machine gun nests. And so if the British soldiers charge, they are charging headlong straight into machine guns. If the German soldiers charge, they're charging headlong into machine guns. And then if you look, even if the Germans are able to take the British trench right here, what the British do is just retreat to their second line of trenches, and now no man's land shifts from here down to here, and all things considered, hours and hours of fighting might happen, and the Germans might have advanced 100 yards. Or if it's a really, really good day, they advance 300 yards. But maybe the next day, the British counterattack, and they get back those 300 yards. But while this is happening, you are having catastrophic level of deaths. The Battle of Verdun was a German offensive where each battle, mind you, were generally month-long engagements, and just at Verdun, each side will suffer 500,000 casualties. I want you to put that into context. The American Civil War, which is the bloodiest war in American history, in 4 years of Civil War, the whole war, you have 600,000 casualties. At Verdun, you have a total of 1 million casualties, and that is one battle. At the Battle of the Somme, the British soldiers lose 60,000 soldiers in one day. And they lose, this is a 5-month-long battle, 5 months straight of the British and French attack, the Germans counterattack. The Germans attack, the British and French counterattack. And all told, both sides at the most might gain 1 mile to 2 miles of land, only to have that retaken a little bit later. And so Dan Carlin, a famous historian, he called this the meat grinder. Both sides would just throw more and more bodies into the meat grinder, and all that came out was carnage. There was no progress. Nothing was happening. To give you perspective of what life was like in the trenches, you were down here. They had to be dug so that you couldn't poke your head up, because with technology, rifles were accurate. You had sniper rifles. You had guns with cartridges. You had machine guns. If you poke your head up, you could immediately be shot. But the absurd thing is when offenses were launched, they still fought with 19th century techniques. Think, Civil War, Revolutionary War, lining up shoulder to shoulder and marching in unison, step left, 2, 3, 4. They would march in unison towards the enemy trenches, which is absurd to think about, because with machine gun nests, when your enemy is standing shoulder to shoulder, is less than a football field away, and is slowly marching towards you, you can understand, for modern technology, that is the easiest target you will ever see in your life. And yes, they do adopt briefly, but instead of marching shoulder to shoulder, they sprint shoulder to shoulder, but they're still sprinting in no man's land. There's no cover. There's nowhere you can hide. All you do is charging straight at your enemy, who's got you in their line of sight and is mowing you down. And even if you take their trench, all they do is move back one line, and then they dig a second backup line of defense, and it's just, this happens over and over and over. Hundreds of thousands of lives get lost for a couple miles of land, and this continues for years. So why was it happening like this? It's because the technology had outpaced the method of warfare. This is the first use of submarine warfare. The Germans especially are utilizing submarines to the extreme. This is the first use of modern artillery. So what used to be cannons that could change a battle was now modern artillery, where these are massive level of explosives that can be launched from a good mile away and can be accurately launched from a distance. So artillery is going to cause massive levels of shock. It's the first use of airplanes in combat. It's the first use of tanks and machine guns. Now, tanks don't show up until very near the end of World War I, but they absolutely, really, it's because the Allied forces are able to mass produce and utilize tanks first. That's actually what breaks the trench warfare, but that really doesn't come until the last 6 months of fighting. It's the first use of poison gas. The Germans developed the first use of chemical warfare with mustard gas. And so what they do with their artillery, they would launch, I'll go back to the trench map, before attacking, they would launch mustard gas into the Allied trenches and then attack. And the funny thing is, this is the one chance where it actually worked better than they anticipated, because the first time the Germans used it, it massacred the first line of defense for the Allied forces. It actually worked better than the Germans expected. So the Germans, they moved into the next line and stopped, not realizing how effective the chemical warfare actually was. But quickly after that, both sides adapted, and gas masks became a regular part of World War II. So like I said, I want you to write this phrase down. It was a 19th century war fought with 20th century weapons. So actually, this is going to be the first part of 1B, and so there's going to be a second video lecture that also ties into it. You do not have to do a summary for just this part. The reflection is for all of the 1B notes put together. All right, sounds good. Have a well of a day.